Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Search me and try me, Master, today. Whiter than snow, Lord, wash me just now, as in thy presence humbly I bow. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Wounded and weary, help me, I pray. Power, all power, surely is thine. Touch me and heal me, Saviour divine. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Over my being, absolute sway. Fill with thy Spirit, till all shall see Christ only always living in me.
Don't feel that you're going to find things as an industrial historian. It took me about 2 weeks to discover that there was a really internationally significant ball clay mining industry here. And so it's been a lot of fun for me to investigate this story a little bit. Tennessee leads the nation in the production of ball clay, and we're going to talk about that today. First of all, I want to ask, are there any paleontologists in the audience? Any geologists in the audience? Okay, we got one geologist. Do we have any ceramics experts or people that work in potteries? Okay, maybe I should leave now and turn the podium over to you. I would ask for your patience and generosity. This is a topic that's still relatively new for me. I am not any of those things. I'm not a miner, I'm not a geologist, I'm not a potter, and so I haven't actually worked the clay either in the ground or on the wheel. So with that in mind, I hope that you'll understand that this is still work in progress for me. One of the reasons I like to do presentations is that you meet people who know things and they share things with you, and several of you in the audience have done that for me while I've been working on this for about a year now. As I like to say to people, this story is millions of years in the making, and that's because if we look at ball clay, we see a sedimentary deposit that was actually placed here many tens of millions of years ago in this part of the world when the seas came upwards into what we now think of as the Mississippi River. Geologists refer to that as the Mississippi embayment, and so the area that we're in was actually underwater, and during that time then sediments were set down into the bottom of that ocean bed that then became the clays that we now mine. And if you talk to Michael Gibson, who is a geologist down at UT Martin, he will tell you this is not dirt, this is sediment. And there's a difference between dirt and sediment, which again I'll leave to the experts who know a lot more about those kinds of things. So there we are, right there. That's where we're standing just about now, is where that little red arrow is pointed. And at that time, not only did it lay down sediments, but there were lots of animals, both animals above the ground and animals in the water, that are remaining here. And if you talk to ball clay miners in this region, they'll tell you about finding these things. In fact, I went out to, the university has a site down near Selmer called the Coon Creek Science Center. If you've not ever been there, they do open houses once a month on Saturdays. Well worth going down. Not only do you get an education on sediments in the region, but they'll take you down into the Coon Creek, the creek itself, and you can dig out fossils that are tens of millions of years old. The photo on the left here are actually a set of shells that I dug out of the ground myself while I was there that are 72 million years old. I mean, it's really kind of cool to hold something in your hand that's that old. This area also, though, had a lot of fauna that grew above the ground. In fact, the picture up on the right here is one I took when I was here at the museum in the spring when Phil Boyd gave a talk. It's a piece of wood that was petrified in a clay sediment layer that he actually mined himself in his time. So the area is actually a very significant area for fossils, and in fact the phrase that's up at the top there is actually a phrase that is applied by paleontologists to these very important locations for fossils around the world. We're one of only 10 in the North American basin that people are interested in. They come from all over the world to look at these fossils. In fact, I believe down at Coon Creek they've just unearthed what will be a small raptor dinosaur that they're going to be working on, and that's being worked on by a group of, I think, Japanese or Korean paleontologists. So people literally come from all over the world to look at this this collection of materials. I think it's also important to realize that modern mining is not the only mining of clay that's occurred here. If you make a visit to any of the museums in this region that look at Native American history, you're going to find clay pots. It's pretty easy to dig clay up out of the ground, various layers, and there's a lot of technical differences between what native peoples may have done and what we do today. But the fact that there's clay in this region has been known for millennia and has been used in different ways to produce different things. I've included a picture there from Wycliffe Mounds that has a nice exhibit on clay pot making that shows how Native Americans actually produced pots from clay sediments in that region of Kentucky. And then actually the smaller one at the top there, if you've never been, there's a beautiful archaeological site in Arkansas, just north of West Memphis. It's a state-run site, and some real beautiful pottery there from that region that was taken from a privately owned site. But not surprisingly, when pioneers and settlers came into the area, they too found clay deposits and started to make things from them. I included a much later photo here of a stove kiln. It was very easy to make brick in this region, and if you're going to start building houses that you want to last for a while, you move beyond timber at a point, and you want to at least have a brick chimney. But so brick making was something that you see early within the heartland in this region. And brick making, I should point out, is different than ball clay. It's different than pottery making. Uses very different types of sedimentary deposits that also include the use of other elements like feldspar, silica. And you'll see brick making facilities all over. There's a very large one in Weakley County right next door to the Gleason Clay Company that is not mining ball clay but is mining other types of clay deposits to produce brick. Of course, we wouldn't be in the South properly if we didn't have potteries that were making what? Whiskey jugs. And seriously, this is an important part of the early history of clay mining in this region, was the production of whiskey jugs. I have seen documentary evidence of an early pre-Civil War clay mining operation somewhere near Paris, but I haven't been able to confirm that. It's referred to in other sources, and I'm just not sure where it was. But the production of earthenware, stoneware, which each have their own specific types of uses. Potters in the audience would know the difference between earthenware and stoneware, but was something that was very big in the region throughout the settlement period, particularly in the late 19th century. But so I guess that begs the question, what is clay? And really, clay is lots of different things. I don't want to get into too much of the technical side. I can leave that to our geologist and our former miner here. Kaolin is a particular type of chemical compound that appears in different forms in the ground. And I could put up chemical symbols that show you the organic chemistry of these different ones. I think for our purposes today, though, you can get a sense out of a chart like this, it's from a historical piece, that the mixture of these different elements within the deposit allow us to do different things with it. And I think most people here are probably familiar with some of the phrases on the left, and you can see the different mixes of elements that are needed to produce those different types of potter's clay, those different types of products that come out of it. It's also important to know that over time, clay manufacturers or clay producers out of clay mines have found all sorts of different manufacturer uses for this. And in fact, it's part of the industry that the uses change constantly. The people that are consuming the clay, the manufacturers, they find other deposits and they go with another company, and so someone here might have to find a new outlet. And so it's really the story of clay mining in West Tennessee, is this constant desire to find new outlets for where it's going. It's included in brick and tile and pipe. It's included in pottery. It's included in things like paper. If you've ever had a glossy magazine, the reason that they can print those high quality colors on that paper is because it includes clay that gives it that real smooth surface to print on. It's also still largely used for electrical insulators. You may not have knob and tube wiring in your house, but if you've seen TVAs replacing all of their towers in this region, if you look on each of those towers, you'll see a little string of porcelain insulators, which probably are all produced using some element of ball clay in this region as well. But let's talk a little bit about the uses of these. I think Tennessee ball clay is particularly important, and ball clays in general are important because they tend to fire a very brilliant white. And so it's one of the pieces that really makes them attractive to manufacturers for various reasons. I think it's important, as we were saying, here's some insulators, there's a jug, we see the brick on the thing. They also use them in tires, all sorts of things. But I think what we always know is that they use it a lot in tile, particularly white tile. If you think about subway tile, whether it's in a subway or a kitchen or a restroom, the beauty of a nice, bright, white tile is that you can tell it's clean. And so if you're in a kitchen, if you're in a bathroom, even subways, the reason that they have white subway tiles is because they want to be able to clean it and for you to know that it's a clean environment. Of course, it's also used for things like bathtubs, urinals, and let's face it, it's a big industry for toilets. So as I've said to some other groups before, probably today you touched a piece of ball clay with some part of your body. And we'll leave it at that for now. In the industry, though, the production of bathroom fixtures is referred to as sanitary ware. And so you'll see that very often when you're doing research on this topic, because that's where those pieces go. So I'm going to tell a little bit about the history, but before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the long story of this and why we still mine clay here. I mean, this is one of many thousands of graphs I could show you, but clay continues to be a highly consumed commodity, and it continues to be something that's highly produced in this region. And as a result, it's useful to talk a little bit just about the basic concept of this. I'm a mining historian, so I got to give you a little rundown here. I'm going to use some photos that are more of a current time, and then we'll go back and look a little bit. But from the mining perspective of the mining company, there's several steps that they go through, regardless of era. First of all, they have to figure out where the clay is. And it underlies the whole region, but it's not consistent. Some areas you get these big, thick seams of clay. They can be 10, 20, 30, even 40 feet thick. In other places, that same little thing might only be a couple inches. And there's also a lot that goes on to trying to figure out where those rich pieces are. They can do diamond drilling or drill cores down in to see where these layers are. They can work from what they know of existing bodies. They have all sorts of now high technology things that they can do, LiDAR and other things to see depressions in the ground from the sky and things like that. But finding a prospect is one of those first pieces, and very often you look around the places you know. Once you have found a prospect, then you have to kind of figure out, okay, how are we going to actually locate the deposit? You can go from maps. This is a map that we'll see again later. But in those early years, very often it was the disruption of the ground that exposed clay. So if you think about times when they were building roads, when they were building railroads, even today, if somebody puts in a new building somewhere, maybe a pole barn out on a farm, they might dig down to put in a foundation and discover a layer there, and they're going to give someone a call and say, hey, I think I got something here, you want to come and have a look at it? And so finding those things, I think, is one of the first parts. But most of the mining companies in this area don't actually own the land that they mine. They do, in many cases, own some of it, but in a lot of cases they actually lease the mining rights from the landowner. And it's a pretty prosperous business for some people in this region. to actually lease farm property out for clay mining. And there's a whole way that that works, but those people get paid a royalty, usually for each ton of clay that's removed. And they can also then negotiate what's going to happen to the land after it's done. The state and the federal government have certain rules about renewing the land, but the landowner can also say, well, I'd really like a lake there. Can you build me a lake when we're done? And so they do a lot of that work. Anybody here own property that's been leased for clay mining? I think I talked to somebody earlier who as a kid played in some clay mines, but so throughout the region you see a lot of that happening today, the leasing of those. And in fact, I went down to the courthouse here in Henry County and actually had a look at the lease records, the property ownership records, and you can actually see on the tax rolls some of these leased properties, the names, the dates, how much, they don't tell you necessarily how much money they're getting paid for the royalties, but at least you can kind of track where this is happening, which as a historian is kind of useful to kind of figure out where the movement of the activities. So once you've found the place, you know that there's a deposit there, they have to remove the overburden. So this is the dirt on the top of that sediment that has no value, and there's a lot of calculations that mining companies do. They have ratios between the amount of overburden and the amount of clay that's under there that they'll tell you if it's too much to remove the top and there's only a little bit at the bottom, we're not going to go there, because they want to make a profit, obviously. But usually the overburden's at most 30 feet. Sometimes it's 60 feet if the clay seam beneath it is worth running. And although there are some examples early on of some truly underground mines, almost all the clay mining in this area is done through open pit, or they have various phrases that they use, but I would call it an open pit, where you actually expose the clay seam, which has its own problems as well as we go along. The seams, as I said, are usually 10 to 15 feet in depth. Some are much larger, 35 to 40 feet. And that ratio to the overburden to clay is something that plays out as they go along. It's kind of fun if you do a search on the web to find all sorts of pictures of clay mining that you don't expect. There are also multiple types of clay. We talked earlier about the differences between some of these at the large level, but actually when you actually get into the mine, these layers are all different. You see the different colors in this picture. You'll see a lot of black clays that have lignite relationships, and they'll call them lignite clays. And it's actually kind of interesting because the different companies will mine different layers of this for their own interests, or they'll mine all the layers and separate them and mix them to make up special mixes that they sell for different uses. But it's kind of good to see this. There's also a problem in this kind of mining, because as soon as you reveal that face, that clay starts to oxidize just naturally with the air around it. And as it oxidizes, it changes its nature, both in the way you handle it and the way that it may use. This is a chemical element. It looks like clay, but it's actually a chemistry there. And so as the oxygen hits it, it starts to change the chemical nature that's there. So keeping these things separate and working between them is important. And then, of course, the material's got to get delivered from the mine, usually to storage. Today we do that by truck, but we'll see some other options as we look back in history a little bit. I think it's kind of funny if you visit some of these clay sheds. It's not just one big building filled with giant piles of clay. It's like little bins of different flavors. It's like a giant test kitchen. You know, we're going to make this recipe today, and they, instead of using the teaspoon or the measuring cup, they got a front end loader. So we're going to do 1 scoop of this black stuff, and we're going to do 2 scoops of this white stuff, and a little bit of this brown stuff, and they have all sorts of cool names for the products that they sell. And it's really kind of interesting just to see how this works. This is not an industry that employs a lot of people in aggregate, probably several hundred. I'm not even sure if 1,000 people are employed in clay mining in Tennessee and Kentucky, which may be one of the reasons that we don't know as much about it. Now that's in the mines. There are also a lot of people that drive truck here or do other sorts of delivery, but still it's not a big, these are not big prospects. They might work several shifts, but each one of those shifts at the clay shed might be 3-4 guys, you know, and there's other things that we'll see. They process this in all sorts of ways. The original reason that they called this ball clay is that when it was originally mined in other places in the world, they would actually break out a brick, a large square rectangle of this clay, but as you handle that, the ends tend to bump off, and so you end up with something that's rounded, and so it got picked up this phrase as ball clay. But they crush this, they bag it, they sometimes put it in water and ship it in train cars as slurries. All depends on what the end user wants the product to be when it arrives. I should also say that there's a cute little gizmo on the left there, which is a shredding device that has knives in it, almost like you'd see with some sort of vegetable thing, and you can jump these balls of clay in there and it shreds them up into smaller pieces. Those are actually still made here in West Tennessee. It's actually called a Gleason shredder because it's made by the Gleason Foundry Company, and I saw some on sale in the Far East, out in Malaysia and Korea, because this company is going out of business. They're selling their Gleason clay shredders out there. So I think that's kind of cool. A lot of shipping now is done in these bulk bags, as they call them. Those can hold 2,000 to 4,000 pounds, and so a lot of the clay gets sent in that version because it's going to be handled by truck then. But still some rail traffic in the area, again, for depending on the product. But really for this region, a lot of the product is going to places in the region now. We'll talk about that toward the end. Cheryl Ward at Old Hickory told me that if they can deliver it within 5 hours of our location, they'll send it by truck, just because they make a better profit there. But going back in history then, back in 1890, they didn't have all that equipment. They didn't have all that technology. They had the clay, but not a lot of people knew about it. And so I want to dump back now and talk a little bit more about the history, because that's why I came here. The real challenge wasn't that the clay wasn't here and they knew how to get it, it's that they didn't have a market for it. And so creating a market, as with any other industry, was the big challenge here. And the real challenge for clay producers back in the early part of the 20th century was that there was a great deal of foreign competition. And that's because we weren't the first place in the world to have ball clay. In fact, the origins of ball clay, and even that phrase ball clay, come from England. And deposits of clay that were produced there for potteries in Dorset and in the central part of the country there. And so if you've ever had a piece of Wedgwood china, that probably had ball clay from Devon, Cornwall, down the southeastern portion. So there was already a very huge industry out of England that was sending clay to the U.S. Most of the early potteries here in the colonial era and into the 19th century were based in New Jersey. A pottery industry then developed in the Ohio Valley. So if you think about the area from Pittsburgh in through Ohio, West Virginia, those river towns that we think of as having a lot of industry, potteries were one of those. And they were importing their ball clay from England. Meanwhile, there's a whole bunch of ball clay right over here in West Tennessee. And trying to figure out not only how you get it to them, but how do you convince those potters to use this stuff when they've been using the material out of England for decades, was one of the challenges. And so, hooray, let's get state government to come in, because we love state government. They always help us with everything. And actually the Tennessee State Geology Department does help. It takes a little time, as I say, albeit slowly, for them to actually do this. But I think if you start to look through the history of geology and ball clay, as I've done a little bit on, you start to see that that's really what happens. In the early geological reports out of the 1860s, 1870s, like this from Safford, they're talking a lot about fossils. And that's why I like to talk about fossils at the beginning, because they're really impressed that there's this fossil record in this. They do make some early mentions to the production of clay pipes down in southwest Tennessee. It was a huge industry in England, making these white clay pipes you see the old guys smoking. So they were making here in Memphis as well. And actually the story for us in this part of the country really doesn't get going until the 1890s. And in fact, this is a copy of the record at the Henry County Courthouse of the very first lease for a clay mine here in West Tennessee. This is actually October of 1894. And Josiah Mandel, who was a clay producer, operator out of Missouri, the St. Louis area, his deposits were being depleted. And what did he hear? A railroad engineer said, hey, we were putting down some railroads over in Henry County, Tennessee, and I think we hit some clay. You want to come and have a look at it? And he came over, did some tests on it, and discovered that not only was it great clay, but there was apparently a lot of it here. So he took this first lease back in 1894, but he still had this challenge. He had clay, but he didn't have any users for it. So he started sending train loads of clay to different potters around the East Coast and the Ohio Valley. Finally got this company here. I found this postcard on eBay, the Harker Pottery in East Liverpool, Ohio, which is actually just east of Pittsburgh. Tried out a sample of the clay and discovered that they really liked it. And so once they started using it and talking to some others, there was interest that came. Again, it was still a challenge. This is a huge industry out east, and these are people who are very used to the products that they've been buying. And we were still in West Tennessee. There were not a lot of roads here, not necessarily a lot of railroads. There were railroads, but there were no roads connecting them to clay mines. So horse and cart to move clay products. It was a very labor-intensive activity in a time when there wasn't a lot of labor. This is a farming area. People don't necessarily want to put down their plow to go and dig clay in a pit. So bringing in labor, sometimes from the cities, malaria issues, clean water issues in the early part of the 20th century, and then also not an understanding of how the end user really wants a really clean product. So if you go into one of these clay pits and you use explosives to blow out clay, everything gets mixed up, and the thing that you're sending out is kind of messy. I think one of the historians referred to this period as an epic of courageous effort to make an industry out of this. I can also add that in 1909, the great state of Tennessee decided well ahead of the rest of the country that they were going to pass a prohibition law. And Tennessee was dry from 1909 until federal prohibition was eliminated. So there wasn't really a market for whiskey jugs in Tennessee, which also undermined the industry. And so you start to see more documents, though I don't need to bore you with too many documents, but here's a 1911 study that was done by the state. It's a kind of a bad picture, but you can see all these different potteries now that are using some of the clay from this region. It's starting to get an understanding amongst different outlets what it can be used for. These publications also, like Nelson's 1911, they start to show photographs of the industry. Now, if any of you are in marketing, part of this is just an effort to show, okay, there is an industry. We have mines, we have people working here, we have lists of companies that are buying the product. This is subtly encouraging investment in the region for others to come in and work at it. They showed various infrastructures. I think it's kind of cool. This cart is in front of one of the clay companies in the region, and you can see it depicted in historical photos here. World War I brought certain advantages to this region. There was reduced access in the United States to clays coming out of England, so more producers were looking at whether they could use the clays out of Tennessee and Kentucky. There was an increased need, in addition to ball clay for pottery and sanitary ware, there are sagger clays that are in this region and other types of clays that are used in refractory brick. So as industry picks up, steel industry and things, the liners for crucibles, the saggers that they use to place other ceramic objects into fire, these clays of various varieties become more useful. And in fact, in World War I, it was considered a strategic mineral resource. And so it got some interest from the federal government as well. All of this encouraging use. There was also a lot of effort on the state of Tennessee's part to try and not only improve the industry of mining, but could we bring in manufacturers? Why are we shipping clay out to a pottery to make a toilet that then gets shipped back to us to use in our restroom here? Couldn't we set up some manufacturing facilities in the area? And it really didn't happen. There was only one that I saw regularly mentioned, which some of you may know from this area, the Russell Pottery. They went on in the later 20th century to do a lot more fine art pottery and dinnerware and things like that, but in the early years they were doing work with a lot of these kinds of earthenware, stoneware types of pots, and did a little bit of work with more production. But there was still a hesitation, I don't expect you to read all of this, but a hesitation on the part of many of the national potteries because they still felt the clays were untested. They didn't really know about them. There was still a lot of art to this rather than science. And so the state of Tennessee, they went ahead and they got the clay tested. Not only did they test it themselves here in Tennessee, but they got somebody from out of state to test it. It's always good if somebody else tells you something's important. You know, like my wife says to me, would you go and tell my mom to do something? Because she never listens to me. You know, and I think that's true even in this industry. More promotion came along. This was 1929, a more regional journal in the Southeast. Again, these get a little bit more technical. They're showing maps with locations of mines on them, with locations of prospects on them, a lot more mechanization. You can see a little dinky steam engine down here at the bottom working in a very big pit. Again, they're encouraging people to realize this is a significant industry and one that maybe you want to get on the bottom floor of as it's developing. They also showed a lot of the uses of the clays that were developing during this time, the companies that are using them, which again was trying to encourage trust, build trust in new purchasers. Other people are using this. You can call the guy you know over at this other clay company or at this other pottery and he can tell you that this is decent quality stuff. They're still encouraging ceramic manufacture in the southwest part of Tennessee. They're kind of hoping that in the Memphis area maybe you get the right combination of pieces. They're also encouraging more mines, that there's a lot more area out here to be developed as they go. Another big spread in 1926. I kind of like just sometimes seeing the photos of the different locations. Here's a shed down in McKenzie. But it's interesting when you look at some of these maps from that period, what's missing on this map as far as clay mining goes? Weakley County, which if you ask people now where the strength of clay is, Weakley County is definitely probably the larger player, although there's still a lot of clay here in Henry County and across the border into Kentucky. And there's a reason for that. Nobody knew that there was clay in Weakley County up into the mid-1920s. And then finally, ta-da, Gleason people discover that there's a lot of clay in the Gleason area, and the Dresden Enterprise was only too happy to make a very large headline about it. And so there's actually this little boom period in the late 1920s, 1927, 28, where everybody's going crazy looking for clay in Weakley County. You know, and again, some of these reports are just wonderful for the photos that they have. I don't know if the people who've worked in mines would like to work in this mine with that kind of a mine wall. It gets a little dangerous at times. Probably my favorite guy out of this whole story is this guy here, George Whitlatch. Not only because he's such a snazzy dresser, but he always likes to put his photos with things he publishes. He's a very interesting guy. He starts as an assistant geologist at the state and then starts to take an interest in this. It becomes a priority for the state in the 1930s to really look at this. And so he got very involved then in more systematically describing clay deposits in West Tennessee for the state geology department. He also had a state photographer who went out and took a lot of photos in the late 1930s. And so you see a lot of these. And those photos help us to see that technology is coming into the region in the 30s, even during the Depression. You're seeing a lot more steam-driven devices that are coming in, some rubber-wheeled vehicles, dump trucks that are being used in different places, but especially the steam shovels. They become a really important part of how the industry burgeons in the early 20th century. And then there are also, as we said earlier, problems with getting from the mine to the railroads. Well, they start to bring railroads right into the mine sites. And so some of these photos of these mining operations, I think this is a great one. You can see they got a lower level rail here that has a rail car coming in like a box car, and then the upper level with that side dumping ore car, and they're just dumping it right in the top of that box car. I also think it's kind of cool when you look. If you look at this, let's go back here. If you look at that engine there, and you see it again here, look at this one there. This is actually a picture from England. Looks like exactly the same engine, the same side dump cars. I mean, I think we call that in the modern era technology transfer. But a lot of, obviously, people are looking at this. Whitlatch finally delivers on this beautiful blue book Clays of West Tennessee that gets published in 1940, which even today, 80 years later, is still a very significant volume, particularly for a historian. And this book just covers all of the chemical tests he did on literally hundreds of different ore sites around the region, maps, photographs, really a major work. It also reveals for us probably lots of unexpected things about 1930s, Depression era, before World War I, how the mines were operated at that time. There's still a lot of handwork, which I think is quite amazing to think of now if you see the modern industry. I mean, I'm not sure that I would want to do this kind of work. I'm a librarian, so I got it probably pretty cushy. A big book could fall on me, I guess, if it was bad. But, you know, some of these photos show a lot of real hard work. I think it's also interesting, I haven't done any research on it, but you see a lot of the labor that's being done in the mines very often is using African Americans during that period. So I'm assuming that from some of the records they're being brought in by labor agencies from Memphis, because again, a lot of people are farmers here. They don't want to go and work the clay mines. There's also some stuff then after the war. For folks here in Henry County, you're probably familiar with Camp Tyson, which was set up during the war to build barrage balloons during the war. At the war's conclusion, I mean, it's a whole other story, which I'm sure somebody's got to present it here at Henry County. Gigantic site with hundreds of houses and thousands of men stationed during the war, which is literally abandoned in the late 1940s. People buy the homes and take them off site. They also end up selling the major buildings to a mining company, Spinks at that time, and now Imerys. Excuse me, I'm sorry, Lois. So, which we have a representative here, so I just screwed that up, didn't I? And so they took the hangar building where they stored these balloons when they were inflated, and they moved a lot of their processing equipment. I don't know if any of this equipment is still in there from 1947.
It looks similar now.
Okay, and again, you get this sense that this is no longer a bunch of guys whacking balls of clay and putting them on a piece, but we're getting into a lot of mechanization with various types of technology to crush. Clay in the ground, as you might expect, is very wet. And so part of the processes is very often drying the clay so that it can be in a powder form that can be bagged. But then lots of different technology improvements in that time since the 1940s to the present. Some photos here of some of the technology that's in place at some of the mines locally now. So you get this sense of this change, much more central processes where a lot of things are coming into a couple of primary processing facilities in the region to be reduced and moved to other places. So by the 1950s, most of this has been resolved, at least as far as the processing. Lots of new technologies come in to do smaller pieces, but those basic concepts we talked about at the beginning are pretty much still in place. Locating it, removing it, processing it, shipping it to customers. So, of course, the ongoing challenge has always been creating these new markets. There's different products, as we said, and so as we think about what's happened in the last 20 years, the creation of those new products has actually found us a new friend. And who is the new friend? The new friend is foreign companies. And so, not surprisingly, if you look at the history of clay mining in the last 50 years, most of the major companies have at one time or another been owned by foreign interests. To this day, Lohoist is are they Belgian firm, and then Imerys, I believe, is Dutch. French, thank you. And even before them, there have been various ones. I interacted with a guy at the Ball Clay Heritage Society in Devon who actually worked for one of the companies that was, I think, British-based at that time that owned some properties here. Folks like Phil Boyd here can give you a much more detailed history of all the different corporate iterations. Someone could probably do a family tree of all the ownership changes, because Ball Clay is very important, but when you look at it in the world scheme, it's usually part of other industrial minerals that a much larger company is dealing with, everything from coal and limestone to things like Ball Clay, and so it becomes part of a portfolio of a larger company. What's also interesting is if we think back to all that work that the state was trying to do to attract in potteries to the region to actually use the clay, we've actually now done that. It hasn't been into our region directly, but what we've got now is we've got a whole bunch of clay tile companies that have set up shop in the middle part of the state. And they start to multiply, and they keep going. And so we're seeing foreign investment in clay companies here now. I'm not sure for your company what percentage of your output is going into, say, tile in Tennessee. I know when I talked to Cheryl, she said it was a very high percentage. So this is now a producer in Tennessee that's getting a lot of ball clay. Now they're mixing it with feldspar, silica, other products to make that clay, and they're not making white subway tile. They're making the backsplash in your kitchen, they're making the tile on your bathroom floor, and they're adding colors, and they're doing all of that work. And in fact, I just heard recently from Cheryl, maybe it's true as well for Henry County, that with the trouble in the Ukraine right now, the Ukraine is a major producer of ball clay into the Italian tile industry. And so the Italian tile companies are having a little bit of problem getting product. And so they're actually pushing more of these companies that are based in the U.S. to produce more tile, which means that we're getting a lot of calls in West Tennessee and Kentucky for higher production and output as we go. I think it's an interesting statistic that as of this year, we have 46% of all the tile produced in the United States is being produced by these companies in Tennessee. All of them are using ball clay from West Tennessee. So this has kind of come around. I think it's very exciting as a historian to study an industry that isn't dead, because I've done that a lot in my career. And so it's kind of I think the end part of this story is that this is still an extremely active industry. And at least when I talk to some of the representatives here who work in some of the companies, they're looking at deposits, known deposits, that will last through their grandchildren's lifetime. Now that's the known deposits. The ones that we haven't yet found, or maybe we're not even aware. I mean, remember, Weakley County wasn't even known for, maybe 30, 40 years before it was discovered to have these very rich deposits. The Mississippi embayment underlies a large region. And in fact, there's a large ball clay deposit that's being operated down in Mississippi, and a couple of others in the region. So I think we can expect that we're going to continue to see this industry. We may not see it unless you're driving down the highway and you see a bunch of dump trucks driving around Gleason or around Henry in this area. But the industry is there, and I think it's exciting to know that it has this long history, but also a brilliant future. So with that, I want to thank several people on this list. Phil's in the audience here, and some others who've helped me throughout this process. I'm still learning about this history and this process. So if you have information, or you know of some people that have any records, I'm always interested. I'm trying to get a little bit more into the social history of this industry, and I think that's the harder part. We can see maps with little miners' picks crossed on them to know where the sites were. Not that you recognize a reclaimed pit these days, but I think trying to understand, particularly in that late 20th century, early 20th century period, what was the life around a pit, I think is harder to do. I have a lot of people who've worked in the industry in the last 20 years who can tell you about their last 40 years, but what was that early period like? I think it'd be great if we could find a diary or some letters or anything that talks about that. So keep me in mind, but thank you so much for having me out. Thanks.
Thank you.